I bear a close resemblance to my famous ancestor. Not really. Tell me, what do you know about the gentleman in the portrait? What do you know about him?
Well, he was instrumental in both the two revolutions.
He was instrumental, yes, in two revolutions, namely the American and then about 10 years later in France during the French Revolution. Anything else? Sir? He visited in Georgetown after a couple of days in Lexington, right? As a matter of fact, this past May, we just celebrated the 200th anniversary of his visit in Lexington with a big 2-day event there, which included visitation by some of his family members who came all the way from France to be with us. Other comments about him?
He was General Washington's aide-de-camp.
He was in General Washington's inner circle, and we will talk about that this evening. That's me in the Palace of Versailles. That's where this portrait hangs. You've seen it many times. It is the most famous portrait of Lafayette. How old do you think he is in this portrait?
30.
In his 30s, 34 to be exact. And what uniform is he wearing? No, not a Continental uniform. It is the uniform of a lieutenant general in the French army. The portrait is dated about 1792 when he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general by King Louis XVI at the time that France was at war with Austria, about during the middle of the French Revolution. Why was France at war with Austria? This woman knows. Who else knows why he was at war, why France was at war with Austria? Who was the French queen at the time? Marie Antoinette. And what was her nationality? Austrian. And who was her brother? The Austrian emperor. So you can see that the Austrians did not take very kindly to the fact that there was this revolution ongoing in France and that the emperor's sister was a prisoner and who would later be beheaded at the guillotine. So that's the uniform he put on to go to the service of his country during the time of the French Revolution. Lafayette County, Kentucky. Look how big it was at that time. This dates from about 1780. Why is that important? 1780. Now, I'll tell you why. That was a full year and a half before the Battle of Yorktown, which decided the fate of the new American nation. Kentucky at that time was part of Virginia. And the legislature in Virginia was so enthralled and taken with General Lafayette that they named this part of Kentucky County in his honor even before the outcome of the war was known. So it was kind of a leap of faith, wasn't it? Really pretty remarkable. Chateau de Chavagnac. This is where he was born, 1757. It's about a 4-hour drive by car south of Paris. It's in the center of France in a very mountainous region called Auvergne. This is the ancestral home of the family Lafayette for about 1,000 years. What do you think that is? That's a tomb. It's in a neighboring church. Who do you think is buried in that tomb? Not Lafayette. One of his ancestors who bore the same name that he did, but who fought alongside as a Maréchal de France or as a French general at the time of Joan of Arc. That's his pedigree. I've been in the house. You see that picture over there on the wall? That beautiful picture of that pond? His family's pedigree is displayed in the house. It goes back 1,000 years. It's name after name after name after name after name. We're fortunate to have with us tonight a young lady from France, French, and she knows how important that type of information is in France. Am I correct on that? Much more important than it is here in the United States. His dad, Michel, a colonel in the French army, who was killed by the English when Lafayette was 2 years old. His mother, Julie, reported to be the most beautiful woman in France. And not only was she beautiful, but she was an heiress. Her pedigree was stronger than that of her husband. She was descended from King Louis IX of France, for whom the city of St. Louis is named, perhaps one of the most famous French kings in all of France's history. Louis IX, made a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. He's in her background, her family. Her family had large land holdings in Brittany, which is that western part of France which juts out into the Atlantic. More about her later. Young Lafayette. After her husband was killed by the English, she left Chavagnac. She left 2-year-old Lafayette in the charge of his grandmother and 2 elderly aunts. Where did she go? She went to Paris. And where does she stay in Paris? Pretty nice place called the Luxembourg Palace. Her family was wealthy enough that that's where they lived. So she moved in with her father, her grandfather, and her great-grandfather, and left him behind in Chavagnac until he was 11 years old when she called him to Paris. Within a year after young Lafayette arrives in Paris, she dies. And a week later, her father dies. At the age of 12, he now has the title of Marquis, inherited from his father, and he is the wealthiest young man in all of France due to the inheritance from his mother's family. He's quite a catch. His great-grandfather, still living, then takes charge of his life. His great-grandfather was a general in the King's Musketeers, and he decides that young Lafayette will follow in the family tradition of military service to the king. At this time in France, there is another family called the Noailles, the Duc d'Ayen, the second most powerful man in all of France behind only the king. He has 5 daughters. He's looking for a suitable arrangement. Who catches his eye? This guy. He's got everything that he's looking for as a son-in-law. So he arranges the marriage with his daughter Adrienne. She is his second oldest daughter. They get married. How old do you think they are at the time of their marriage? Close. He's almost 17. She's almost 15. Can you imagine? They live together in the family residence near the Chateau de Versailles, just outside of Paris. But her mother insists that they not live together as husband and wife for 2 years. I think he sneaks on that a little bit, but that was the deal. That was the arrangement. Now, you remember what I said, that his father-in-law was the most powerful man outside of the king. And he had his own army, dragoons. And as a gift to his son-in-law, young Lafayette, he makes him in the captain of his dragoons and places him at the barracks at Metz in eastern France. While he is there, the Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of King George III, is on an official state visit to France and stops at Metz and has dinner with young Lafayette and shares with him what's going on in North America. The Duke of Gloucester and the king, his brother, are on the outs. He doesn't like him, and the king doesn't like his younger brother. And so he tells Lafayette all about this glorious revolution by these colonists in America, which he supports. And he fills young Lafayette's head with this idea of liberty and self-control over your whole life. This picture shows a fellow by the name of Silas Deane, who was the colonial representative in Paris at this time. His job? To enlist young French officers into the cause of American liberty. He meets up with Lafayette. He says, if you come to America and fight alongside General Washington, you can come in as, are you ready for this? A major general in the Continental Army. How old is he? 19. What were you doing when you were 19? It's incredible. But he had everything that Deane was looking for. Title, prestige, and most importantly, what? Money. That's one thing that George Washington liked too, was money. All right. So he signs him on, makes a contract with him. He comes to America as a major general. How do you think that went down with his father-in-law, the Duke d'Enghien? How do you think it went down with King Louis XVI? Not good. Because the perception would be that if you have someone of this rank and stature and title, and this close to the throne, that's almost an act of treason against England, right? So Lafayette was forbidden to leave. Did it stop him? Well, you know the answer to that. No, it didn't stop him. Because he had what? Money. And with the money, he bought his own ship, bought his own crew, and set sail for America, along with 30 of his fellow officers who were also seeking fame and glory. He did not speak a word of English. And he was not a mariner. I spent 22 years in the Navy. I still got seasick. He was sick on the entire voyage, almost 2 months. At that time, to cross the Atlantic was anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks on a typical crossing. And most of the time, it was just as rough as could be. So he tried to learn as much English as he could, and he tried to learn as much about warfare tactics as he could during the 2-month transit. He arrives in South Carolina, and it takes him several weeks to make his way to where? Philadelphia, which was then what? The colonial capital of America. And he presents himself to the Continental Congress and says, oh, by the way, I'm General Lafayette, I'm young Lafayette. Silas Deane said that if I came over here, you would make me a major general in your army. So here I am. Well, you can imagine what they thought about that. They said, now let's see, how old are you? Well, I'm 19. Have you ever been in battle? Never. Can you speak the English language? No. Do you have any money? Yes, and lots of it. So they hired him on. July the 31st of 1777, the Congress confirmed his rank as a major general in the Continental Army. Think about that. It's amazing, isn't it? Well, there he is, a portrait painted close in time to the date that he received his commission. Handsome young guy, right? Very persuasive, incredibly persuasive, as a matter of fact. But what do you think this guy thought about it? After all, he was in charge of the war, right? He had had his fill of foreign European officers who were just dandies. Titles, wanted big titles in America, but could offer very little. How are they going to recruit anybody? How are they going to give orders to anybody? Who's going to obey them? Washington thought that this was going to be only an honorary title, that he would never really have command, that he would just be another one of these European dandies who would come over, maybe hang around for a while, and then go home. Nothing could be further from the truth. On the evening that the Congress confirmed his appointment, there was a huge dinner party in Philadelphia. The party was thrown in the honor of George Washington, and the two met that night. And as we say here in America, they hit it off instantly. There was some bond of admiration and attraction between the two, even though there was 25 years age difference. But Washington saw something in this young man who gave up a life of luxury to come fight for the American cause. And he was very impressed with that, particularly since Lafayette said, "I only want the right to serve. I have come to learn not to teach." And Washington made him that night a member of his inner circle and invited him to stay at his personal residence. Isn't it interesting how the things that are supposed to work out in history have a way of working out in ways totally unanticipated? During the time of the American Revolutionary War, Lafayette became, in my judgment, the most trusted general in his army. He gave him very special missions to carry out. Their relation grew to the point that it appears by correspondence exchanged between the two men throughout their lifetime that Washington considered Lafayette the adopted son that he never had. And if you remember, Lafayette considered him the father that he never had. Think about it. It was an amazing bond that existed throughout all of their lives. So much so that Lafayette had only one son. And do you know what the son's name was? George Washington Lafayette. And George Washington was his son's godfather. They were together at the darkest moments of the Revolutionary War, Valley Forge, and at the moment of greatest glory at Yorktown. If you were fortunate enough to be in one of the regiments under the command of General Lafayette, you had good-looking uniforms, you had food, and just look how he attired himself. There was nothing timid or humble about him. He knew who he was. He had great pride in himself. And he used his money not only to make himself look good, in fact, he rode on a magnificent white horse. But he saw to it that the troops under his command had the best that his own personal wealth could provide to them. During the war, when there was a down period of time in 1779, things were desperate for the Continental Army. And Washington asked Lafayette to return to France to advocate at the French court for more aid. We know that the Continental Army was always without adequate funds. Mutineers, deserters, it was a huge problem. It's hard to imagine, but it is true that at that time, even Washington and later even Lafayette would hang people for desertion to make an example. Don't leave. We need you, and we need you now. And yes, Washington had an army, but it was pretty ragtag. But the one thing that he knew he needed in order to secure the victory over the English was what besides money? What was it that he desperately needed and didn't have? A navy. Exactly. Like I said, I did 22 years in the United States Navy. There it was. On this mission back to France in 1779, 1780, Lafayette was able to secure a commitment from the king that he would send an expeditionary force to America. 14 ships of the line. We would call them today battleships, frigates, supply convoys, and an army of anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. That was the shot in the arm that Washington needed. Now, when he was advocating for this expeditionary force with the king, who did he suggest should lead the force? Himself! Of course, himself. But he's still a very young man. You know, he's 22 years old. This guy winds up being the boss. Who is it? Rochambeau, General Rochambeau, a well-respected, distinguished general of the French army for many years. As we know, in the military, the pecking order is important. Who's on charge? Who's at the top, right? Who's at the top? Washington. The king made it expressly clear to Rochambeau that when you arrive, you are the second most important person in the expeditionary forces, but General Washington has command over you and over all of the forces. Really kind of an amazing thing. Now, one of the things that I just recently found out was General Rochambeau was a lieutenant general in the French army. There's only one position higher than that in the French army, and that's called a maréchal de France. The king made Washington a maréchal so that there was no question on paper who had the final say. As the war in the New York area began to move into the South, into Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, Washington turned to Lafayette to lead the campaign in Virginia. And he gave him two orders. The first one dealt with this guy. Any idea? Not Aaron Burr. Benedict Arnold, who was formerly a general in the Continental Army in charge of West Point, but who sold out the plans how to capture West Point to the British. Of all the people during the war that Washington had it out for, it was this guy right here. And when he sent Lafayette into Virginia, he said, find him and hang him on the spot. The second part of his mission in Virginia was to deal with this guy, General Cornwallis, who was the British commander. What was his mission? Bottle him up at Yorktown. He did. You see all the fortifications? Who's been to Yorktown? A couple people. You've seen all the fortifications there and so on and so forth. There was only one escape route for Cornwallis. What would it have been? Down the York River into the Chesapeake Bay. Did that happen? You bet your bottom dollar it didn't happen. And you know why it didn't happen? Because a second French fleet under command of General de Grasse, this was the French Caribbean Fleet, arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake in early September of 1781 and engaged the British, who had sent a fleet down to evacuate Cornwallis and his troops from Yorktown. But de Grasse's fleet was 38 ships, 28 of which were ships of the line. The English had 14. It was a rout, and the English fleet returned to New York. There was no escaping for Cornwallis. The Battle of Yorktown proceeds in October, about this time of year, 250 years ago, right? Constant bombardment for about 10 straight days and surrender. The Battle of Yorktown is essentially the turning point in the American Revolutionary War. For all intents and purposes, it's over. Now, I love this picture. This portrait also hangs in the Palace of Versailles. It hangs in the Gallery of the Generals. It shows Yorktown, and it's entitled The Final Orders. Can you see which one is Washington? Can you pick him out? Right there. I don't know. Right there. And who do you think this fellow is? Lafayette. There he is. Very importantly, part of the great success of Yorktown. Now, you remember that I told you that young Lafayette, at the age of 19, left France without a great bon voyage from his family or the king. But guess what? When he returns, he's what we call a hero. Not only a hero on this side of the Atlantic, but a hero back in France. And that's why Lafayette today is often referred to as the hero of two worlds, right? France, Europe, and the United States. He was very instrumental. In fact, he was right at the center of the French Revolution. We will not go into that tonight because that's another story. But he brought back with him from his years of experience in America the concept of individual liberty, the right of people to determine for themselves how they should live. Because France at that time was still a feudal society ruled by an absolute king. And he wanted to change all of that. I will tell you, he was right in the middle of it. That story is, in some respects, just as fantastic as the story of him in America. But we move ahead 40 years. Who's this guy? James Monroe, President of the United States. And not only President of the United States, but would you believe, a comrade in arms with Lafayette. Lafayette was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, and this guy took care of him. James Monroe, President. And so America is getting close to its 50th anniversary, and President Monroe invites him to come back as the nation's guest to see what this country looks like 50 years after he helped to create it. And he comes back and he goes on a tour of all 24 states. He originally thinks he's only going to visit the original 13 states and spend about 6 months in America. But it takes him 13 months to visit all 24. And he travels 6,000 miles. And he's now 67 years old. He travels with his son, George Washington Lafayette, with a valet and also a secretary. And included in that great tour of America was the visit here to Kentucky in May of 1825. That's what Lexington looked like. Not too big, but would you believe that when he arrived, a crowd of 10,000 people gathered to see him? And why? Because he was the last living major general of the American Revolutionary War. We've lost a lot of history in this country. But in 1825, he was still well known and loved by the American people. When he was in Lexington, he visited this building, which still exists on South Upper Street here in town. This was called the Lexington Female Academy. And the students, all young ladies, we would call it today a boarding school or a finishing school, I guess you would say. Lexington at that time was actually regarded as a very cultured place. And the students there composed poetry and sang songs for him. Do you know the name Sally Bingham from Louisville? Nods, heads, nods. She died 3 weeks ago. She attended the events in Lexington. And why did she attend the events in Lexington? She calls me one night and she says, by the way, Sally Bingham was an heiress to the Bingham family fortune that owned WHAS TV and radio in Louisville and the Courier-Journal and Louisville Times. So she calls me and she says, I understand you're putting on this program to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to Lexington. And I said, yes, that's right. But why are you interested in that? Are you ready for this? She says, well, my fourth great-grandmother was the young lady who sang for him. And I said, yes, you're coming as one of our honored guests to the dinner. She died shortly after coming all the way from New Mexico to be with us. All right, so while he was here, who's seen this portrait? Yes, where does it hang? Old State Capitol building in Frankfort, 50 miles from here, right? He set for the portrait when he was here. Who painted that? Matthew Jewett from Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Very famous portrait artist at the time. Anybody have any idea what that building is? Transylvania. Transylvania College at that time was located in what we call Gratz Park today. That building burned down in 1829. It was only at that time then that they moved to across the street to their present campus. But that's where the official greeting took place, right there in Gratz Park. And Transylvania awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree that day. That's the house that he stayed in. It was actually a tavern, Postlethwaite's Tavern. You know where it's located in Lexington? Well, do you know where the main library is downtown? They call Phoenix Park. That's where it was. This house was right on that corner. Phoenix Hotel, too. Yeah. Now, in honor of the 200th anniversary of his visit to Lexington last May, we had sponsored a year-long essay contest for all the high school students in Lexington. to write on Lafayette. This young man from Dunbar was the winner of that contest, and he read his essay at our dinner. The night before Lafayette entered Lexington, he stayed at the Keene House, which is Keeneland. Elizabeth Stoll, does anybody know Elizabeth Stoll? She does. She's part of the Keene family, and she was with us to talk about her life as a child in that house. She even has the bed and the table that he slept in and ate on. There's me. Who's the lady in red? That is Madame Sabine Sabronier. She is Lafayette's 7th grade granddaughter from Paris, a friend of mine. That's her niece to the right, and that was the Lafayette impersonator that we had with us for a couple of days. I've been in France the last 2 summers. I'll talk about that in the next slide coming up. But anyway, while Sabine was here, we visited Lafayette High School. Graduate? Yay! How wonderful was that to visit Lafayette High School, built in 1939 and still with us today. She had interaction with the students. And as a result of that visit, there is now a program of exchange between the Lafayette High School students in Lexington and the counterpart, Lafayette High School in Chateau Rouge, France. Now, I'm very proud of this. This is the historic marker that we put up in Gratz Park at the exact location where Lafayette was welcomed into Lexington. So if you know where Gratz Park is, behind the old library in Lexington, if you're ever in that part of town, be sure to go by and see that. And then, as I said, we concluded the evening and the activities with a dinner at the Embassy Suites. More than 300 people at the dinner. Now, I showed you a tomb earlier this evening. There was some suggestion maybe that was Lafayette's tomb. This is his tomb. It's in the Picpus Cemetery, which is one of only 2 private cemeteries in Paris. The cemetery was established by his wife, who had preceded him by more than 20 years in death. The interesting thing about the cemetery is that immediately adjacent to it are 2 mass graves. In those 2 mass graves were thrown the headless bodies of the victims of the guillotine. Lafayette's own wife's mother and sister and grandmother are in those mass graves. So she bought this piece of ground to be close to them. That's where she's buried, that's where he's buried, and several of their children. You notice all the French and American flags? Every year on the 4th of July, well, I should say this too, the guillotine. They still have burials in the Picpus Cemetery. But who do you think can be buried there? Descendants, people whose relatives were victims of the guillotine. Pretty interesting, isn't it? Pretty interesting. General Pershing, World War I, 1917. After his arrival in France, the first place he went was to General Lafayette's tomb. And that's where the immortal words, "Lafayette, we are here," were uttered in gracious thanksgiving for when he came to fight for America. Every year on the 4th of July since 1917, there has been a ceremony in this cemetery to commemorate General Lafayette. That's me, putting the wreath on his tomb in that cemetery. It was 116 years to the day from the time that General Pershing had done the very same thing. I'm going to conclude with this statue. Have you seen it? This is a statue which is in Paris. It's in that part of Paris close to the Arc de Triomphe. It's about a 15-minute walk from there. It's in a place called the Place des États-Unis, the place of the United States. And in my estimation, it shows the two giants of the American Revolutionary War, Washington and Lafayette. And look at the admiration in the eyes exchanged between the two, the great respect that these two men had for each other. As I said, the relationship really of adopted father and adopted son. The statue was sculpted by the same sculptor who gave us the Statue of Liberty. In fact, Pulitzer, George Pulitzer, you've heard of the Pulitzer Prize. In 1895, he was the editor of the New York Times. And he was so taken with the magnificence of the Statue of Liberty that he had the same sculptor commissioned to give us this statue. And he donated it to the city of Paris in 1895. It's about my favorite statue in the whole world. I love it. Most people have never seen it, and we even have a young French woman here who's been to Paris many times, and she hasn't seen it. So if anybody is planning to go to Paris, please be sure that you stop by and see this magnificent statue. And it's more than just the mutual admiration and respect of two men for each other, but it shows the bond, it shows the relationship, it shows the alliance between France and America, which allowed us not to be eating fish and chips this evening. That's my story. Questions? Fini. Oui, madame.
You mentioned that only the descendants were victims of the I wonder how much tension there was between Lafayette and his wife, because from what I understand, he voted for the king's death.
Lafayette? No. It was the Duc d'Orléans.
No, but not just him.
No, Lafayette, no.
He did not.
No. The question was, did Lafayette support the decision to have Louis XVI executed? The answer is no. At the time that the king was executed, he was imprisoned in Olmütz in Austria. Questions? Is it a fascinating story? Is it practically unbelievable? Yeah. You see why I'm very interested in the man.
How did he maintain his wealth through all these big events that he...
The question is, how did he maintain his wealth? Needless to say that during the time of the French Revolution, he was on the outside of the revolutionaries, and they confiscated everything that he had. He was imprisoned for 5 years in an Austrian prison. He tried to walk a middle ground between recognizing the need to bring France into a more modern society, but he should have been aware of, in my judgment, that to have a complete reversal in terms of how a country which had been governed 1,000 years by an absolute monarch, that those people were not just simply going to walk away and say, have at it, right? So he had a very tough mission trying to sell the French royal family on the idea that they needed to lessen up a bit with respect to their absolute control over the country. So on the one side, you could see why they would be somewhat less than favorably inclined toward him. But the other side of the coin was that while he advocated for certain reforms in France, he was not willing to go as far as the crazy revolutionaries who wanted to destroy the country completely, and almost succeeded. I mean, they abolished the calendar, They outlawed the church, they arrested the priest, and for anyone who was suspected, and I think it was called the law of suspects, if anyone was suspected of being not fully on board with the idea of the revolution, you knew what your fate was going to be. So Lafayette had no part of that. So you could see that in terms of the revolutionaries, they had no use for him. And in fact, Robespierre had issued a warrant for his arrest, which he knew would be his execution at the guillotine. That's why, in that uniform that I showed you as a lieutenant general, he was in charge of the French Third Army at the Austrian border. And when he heard that the warrant had been issued for his execution, he fled into what he thought was Holland. We would call it Holland today. The Austrians were in control. They arrested him because they considered that he was as much responsible for the fact that Marie Antoinette and the royal family were no longer in power. Plus, they recognized too that his idea of revolution, getting rid of absolute monarchs, might accidentally spread outside the borders of France and could threaten Austria too. He spent 5 years in an Austrian prison. The last 2 years of his life, his wife and his 2 daughters were in prison with him. How do you think they got out of that mess? Anybody got any idea how they got out of that? James Monroe was very helpful in securing Adrienne's safety in Paris because she was also arrested, put in the Temple prison, and would have been slated for execution. But Monroe was the American ambassador in France at the time, and he and his wife paid regular visits to Adrienne Lafayette in prison and let the French revolutionary government know that America would not take very kindly to the execution of George Washington's closest friend and his adopted son. But how did the Lafayette family get out of the Austrian prison? One man. His name begins with N. Napoleon. When Napoleon came to power, he conquered Austria. And as a condition for the peace accords, they had to release the Lafayette family. They came back to essentially not much. Her family still had one chateau called La Grange, which is located about 40 miles southeast of Paris. And that's where he and his family would reside for the last 30 years. I have been there. It's not open to the public. Have you been there? It is not open to the public. And there's a good reason why. Everything in the chateau is almost exactly as it was the day he died, including the mail that was delivered to him that day, still bound up with a ribbon on his desk. And the documents that he personally was familiar with, including chartering the ship, which was called the Victory, La Victoire, which was called the Victory. All of the documents associated with the important moments in his life are all there. And I'm not talking about photocopies. I'm talking about originals. So you can see why it's not available to the public. It was one of the most fascinating afternoons of my entire life to actually be there. Questions?
What became of his son?
His son went into politics with his dad, kind of on sort of the liberal side of things, or in other words, continuing to push for reforms. Lafayette, in my judgment, could have been the first president of the French Republic. There's a fellow who lives in Shelbyville, Kentucky. He's an acquaintance of mine. He is the 5th great-grandson of King Charles X of France. Now, why is that important? Charles X was the last of the Bourbon monarchs in France. And after Lafayette succeeded in having him removed from the throne, there was a fellow by the name of Louis Philippe, who was known as the Citizen King of France, right? The choice came down in France to either Louis Philippe or Lafayette. And Lafayette decided that the French people and the way he wanted that government to operate was they still should have a figurehead monarch, but with a Republican type of government. So he bowed out of the race, if I can put it that way, and threw his support behind Louis Philippe. Unfortunately, Louis Philippe did not last too long either. He was succeeded by Napoleon II, who was also an emperor of France, or the third, I guess it was. But Lafayette's son was in their legislature at that time, again, trying to battle for more freedom and rights for all people. And obviously, they had descendants because you remember I mentioned Sabine? She's descended from his only son, George Washington Lafayette. It's pretty cool. Questions? Yes and no. The United States Congress, during the time that he was imprisoned, made loans to a Dutch bank that he was allowed to draw on. And in fact, George Washington gave personal funds to help him during the period of his imprisonment. He never acquired all of his huge fortune back, but remember, he had spent a lot of it during the American Revolutionary War.
A lot of the, I think I'm French, and I didn't know that until very recently, but after, when Charles X came back to France, the French nobles, aristocrats who had lost money and territories during the Revolution were awarded reparations. And it was not, to the extent of their wealth, but they received a significant amount of money paid by the French taxpayers.
Yes.
And if I could say, we would have been much better off with Lafayette as president, because Napoleon Bonaparte III, who was elected, turned into a tyrant and
Yes. Do you have a question back there?
I have a question about his visit to Georgetown, and my understanding is that he visited as Johnson again at the Shelter Academy. That was a year later. So he was visiting all around, visited Lexington, but then moved to who knows where, and then came back.
Let me answer your question this way. This is an English translation of his diary when he visited America. With respect to Georgetown, after 48 hours of uninterrupted festivities, we departed Lexington, where we left Governor Carroll and nearly all of our traveling companions from Tennessee, Louisville, Frankfort, accompanied only by a detachment of voluntary cavalry from Georgetown. We turned sharply to the left, and in 36 hours, we reached that point of the Ohio where the beautiful city of Cincinnati, in which General Lafayette was awaited with the most lively impatience, stands. That's the official account in the diary. Now, I have no question in my mind that he did stop to visit with Johnson and his family and then pushed on. But in terms, and I would think that maybe the newspapers at that time, the local newspapers, would have accounts of that visit. So I think it happened. But if you're looking for historical documentation, that's the only reference to Georgetown right there.
There are eyewitness
That's what I'm saying, that I'm sure that there would be a new, I'm just saying that here, it's not.
What are the years covered in that diary?
1824 and 1825. So the answer to your question would have been, he would have come to Georgetown directly from Lexington. That would have been May the 17th of 1825. May the 17th of 1825. And I think that was a Tuesday.
Did Lafayette keep a diary during the war?
Lafayette, the question is, did he keep a diary during the war? Do you remember what I said about he had no command of the English language when he left France? So one of the very great questions to me has always been, how did he get by? Well, he had a very good friend who spoke French. You have any idea who that was? Very famous person. His picture appears on a $10 bill. Who am I talking about? Hamilton. Hamilton spoke French, and he helped him a lot. But I do know this. When Washington went to the Continental Congress to give him command of the Virginia campaign, one of the things he told the Congress was that he has shown great improvement in the English language. Because it has always interested me, really, how good was his English. You never hear much commentary on it. Because the books that you read, they clean it up for you. He did this, he did that, he ordered this retreat, and so on and so forth. But the Battle of Brandywine occurred within a month after he was commissioned, or his commission was confirmed by the Congress. He still didn't speak very good English. And yet he led the retreat from the forces that allowed a good portion of Washington's army to be retained. So how do you do that? So if I were a young man who was very interested in American history, I would do a dissertation on exactly that. There's nothing written on it. But what a great topic to write on. Huh? What a great topic to write on. So in terms of, and this is another thing that interests me too, in terms of whether he kept a diary, in terms of whether he kept a diary, I don't think that he did, but he was a prolific letter writer. And there's lots and lots and lots of letters that he wrote during the time he was here. That's why they're able to write books.
Thank you very much.